To everybody's relief, Thomas and Diesel were still there when the crew returned to the shed next morning. Thomas looked quite timid, and Diesel was beaming. Neither driver nor stoker knew what had happened in that shed, but it was obvious that Diesel had exploited Thomas's fear of ghosts for his own amusement. Just for that, Maxine was very rough on the starter. Diesel whined terribly. Before long, they were en route to Derby, coasting along the line at a riveting 20 miles an hour. A particularly encouraging signalman had suggested a less traveled route, mostly disused since the beaching cuts had gutted it in the 60s. Apart from the occasional multiple unit, none of which were running today, they had their run of the line for a whole 30 miles. "I still don't get it," mumbled Thomas, mostly to himself. "I imagine there are a lot of things you don't get," the Diesel said dismissively, as he hauled Thomas along the half-rusted rails. "What did you want with mail cars? I mean, sure, they're important, but we have replacements." Diesel seethed. "You think I wanted the cars?" "Well, yeah, you stole them, didn't you?" Thomas was more puzzled than ever. Diesel fumed at this. He couldn't allow Thomas to believe that his plan had been so pitifully simple. So he cracked, and a rather sinister monologue spewed forth from his grill. "That train carried £200 million in government bonds, representing a large chunk of the Northwestern's fiscal assets. The plan was to intercept them, which would have led to a few weeks of economic instability, just enough time for my foreign agents to exploit the Sudrian economy's weaknesses and buy major shares in local industries that support the railway." Thomas's jaw hung open. His traction improved. "What does any of that mean?" "I told you wouldn't understand." "Why do you understand? Government bonds? What even are government bonds? What engine understands this stuff?" "This engine does. You can be ignorant to human endeavors if you like, but I've taken great pains to learn as much as I can." And he added, darkly, "They're the only endeavors that matter. People hold all the power." Thomas didn't like the way Diesel talked about humanity. He was so sinister about it. Thomas had met a lot of stuck-up engines in his lifetime, but they had all agreed with him on at least one thing. The passengers' well-being took priority over everything. No matter how rotten an engine was, none of them would ever have considered hurting a human being deliberately. It was simply beyond the pale for a railway engine. But Diesel was beyond the pale. Thomas wondered what government bonds were. They sounded important, like something Sir Topham Hatt might lose hair or sleep over. Would Diesel hurt people on purpose? It was a horrible thought. Maybe Duck had been right. Maybe Diesel was more than a nuisance. "Well, it's up in smoke now," said Thomas, partly reassuring himself. "You're foiled again," and he blew a raspberry at him in the most childish way. "Yes, I know." At that moment, they heard an unfamiliar horn. "Oh no! There's an oncoming train! We've got to hide!" Diesel just kept at the same pace, unfazed. "There's nowhere to hide. Let's just act natural." It was a big mainline Diesel, one of the boxier ones like Boko or Bear. Their eyes grew wide upon seeing the bright blue tank engine. They stared uncomfortably at Thomas for a solid minute as they passed with their mixed goods. Thomas was quivering with fright. But fear didn't look good on him, and he knew that. So he sucked in a deep breath and then grinned and winked at the passing Diesel. Moments later, they were out of view, but he could have sworn he'd seen them smile nervously back. Once the engine was gone, Thomas's stress returned. "They could warn the yards that I'm on the loose." "It's off of our buffers now. We'll just have to hope they keep quiet." Another thought occurred to Thomas. "Shouldn't I be under a sheet or something?" "Don't be so theatrical," dismissed Diesel. "Everyone will know you're a steam engine either way. The key is to pick the right routes and stay out of sight altogether." "If you say so." And he added snidely, "Nobody does deception like you." But Diesel took it as a compliment. "No, nobody does." It wasn't long before they encountered their 10th signalman. They'd passed hundreds of boxes. but the few charitable men that Maxine had encountered had concocted a believable and vague cover story. Control knew exactly where they were. They just didn't know what they were. By the time a bright blue steam engine dragging a dirty black Gronk came rattling through, most signalmen were surprised to find that this train was not, in fact, a slow works train on the way to an impromptu maintenance job. But all the same, they had already given them the green. There was no sense in halting them now. It was a con worthy of Devious Diesel. Almost. They were at the end of their current path. They would need to convince a new signalman to be complicit in their ruse. And as he marched back and forth along the signal box deck, high above both engines, he did not look friendly. Both driver and fireman gazed up at him. Without warning, Maxine slapped Marcel hard on the back. "Well, your turn." "What?" "Well, I've convinced all the others," reminded Maxine. "Why should I have all the fun? And don't you want to try your hand at haggling with an angry signalman already?" "No," Marcel cried bluntly. "Oh, come on, Marcy. You can be convincing when you need to be." And she held the cab door open for them. "You must have something to offer him." So Marcel descended to the ballast, and then scaled the wooden steps to the box, cursing their driver for having such unfounded faith in them. The signalman looked irate. "You'd better have a good reason for travelling my rails without permission." The veins in his forehead were showing. "We're trying to get our engine home, sir," said Marcel sheepishly. "He's right down there." And they stood aside so the signalman could see. "His name is Thomas. Maybe you've heard of him?" "Oh, sure I've heard of him." And the man flicked his hand in a dismissive motion. "Some famous engine from the kids' cartoons. You could be driving the Royal Scot for all I care. If you're not on my timetable, you're not getting through." It seemed they had hit a genuine roadblock. This wasn't working. Marcel just scratched their head, and then thought for a moment. Then, with a cough, they said, "Do you have any debt?" The signalman was dumbfounded. "What?" "Well, you look stressed. Looks like financial stress. I was an accountant for 10 years. I know a thing or two." The signalman abandoned all pretense. "I'm gonna level with you. Yes, but my wife doesn't know a thing." "And she'll never have to, if you follow my advice." In less than an hour, Marcel had balanced his books and given him a list of sure-thing investments to pursue. In a week's time, this particular signalman wouldn't be a signalman anymore. He would be retired in luxury. Marcel would never learn of this, of course, because they were off and away toward Southampton, barreling down a clear main line. Thomas had never seen Diesel's mood lighten as much as it did when Darby came into view. His wide eyes and drawn breath would lead you to believe that he had just set his eyes on Stonehenge or the pyramids of Giza, not a grimy, worn-down old works complex. But, to be fair, it was a truly expansive complex. Expansive and incredibly bleak. Thomas felt a chill run up his frame. This was where it had first begun. This was where dieselization had started. This is the place that killed Gordon's family. This is the place that had killed his own family. Thomas had not been very involved in the Battle of the Tractions back in the 60s. That was the big engine's cause. He had been too preoccupied competing with the buses and lorries, desperately trying to keep his branch line relevant and profitable. Dieselization had never been his fight. But even so, he felt something visceral stirring within him, gazing up at the humongous buildings before him. One of them had obviously been an erecting shop for assembling steam engines once upon a time, but it had been refitted and restructured so heavily that it was barely recognizable as such. It was suffocated on both sides by newer, colder-looking facilities that had been designed to service diesel engines from the very first. The whole plant felt corrosive somehow. Evil, even. But Devious Diesel had none of these feelings when he looked up upon the great structures. All Diesel saw was home. But his enthusiasm drained the closer they got. He could see rivets failing, the sheet metal peeling. The roofs of more than a few buildings were beginning to dip slightly. "No," His breath began to leave him, and he sped up toward the engine shop, as if racing to help a pedestrian who'd just been struck by a car. As if Diesel would ever do something so selfless, even if he could.
It's going to pieces. All of it.
Is that abnormal? Asked Thomas, his coupling still aching from the sudden yank.
Yes,
Diesel nearly shouted.
It was the cleanest, most well-organized works complex in the world when I last saw it. What has happened?
He halted before the Diesel workshops, which trailed a mile into the distance and boasted 3 service lines, each of which ended in a hazard-striped garage door. One of them was half open, allowing Diesel to peer inside and see the work that was taking place. There weren't many engines inside, only 3 or 4, but it set him at ease to see that these shops were still doing something. That sense of calm was quickly disrupted by a gruff, hardened voice.
You have some nerve, you know that? I told you never to return.
Diesel's face softened. For a moment, he didn't look like the cold, unfeeling schemer that Thomas had come to know. He looked like a startled child, caught with his hand in the cookie jar and chocolate all over his lips. Whoever this man was, he had power over him.
Mr. Pilkington.
His voice was almost inaudible, more fumes than anything.
I didn't expect you to still be working here.
The stern man scoffed.
I'll never escape this place. It'll die before I do.
He looked around the aging facilities, his hands in his overalls, his boots crunching the ballast as he turned.
And the way things are going, I give us another year before British Rail shuts us down for good.
Thomas wasn't sure, but he thought he heard something heavy drop in the pit of Diesel's motor. It was like his oily heart had been dislodged and fallen right through his frames, landing hard on the sleepers.
No, it can't be.
It can, Pilkington said plainly, and he scrubbed his 5 o'clock shadow wearily. The bags under his eyes matched Diesel's, but Thomas figured he had developed them by staring at blueprints and into engine compartments for long hours, not from staring at a set of buffers schemingly like a lunatic for hours on end. He was awfully haggard looking. He was in his mid-60s, maybe. His blonde hair was giving way on the sides to a bleached white, and his smile, if it had been a smile, was incomplete. He looked as old and worn down as the shops he worked for.
How did you know it was me?
It wasn't even spoken like a question. It was just a defeated statement of truth.
I've completed more gronks than crossword puzzles,
Mr. Pilkington said declaratively.
You really think I can't tell?
Diesel groaned in anguish. He had already known the answer.
And what the hell have you got him for?
Snapped the haggard engineer.
You brought me a dead bird as a present.
Thomas just scoffed. No, indeed. He's been trying to kill the bird for years, but he's no good at it, I'm afraid. Pilkington chuckled. Just a single hoarse breath.
Funny. But why are you here, really?
Diesel cut in, perhaps to try and provide the least embarrassing version of the story possible.
There was an operational mix-up. We were transported to Manchester by mistake. Manchester?
He scratched his scruffy face again.
So that's what it's come to, then. That's one hell of a blunder. The people I work for.
So, you're not going to scrap me, then? Pilkington just stared. He looked like he had a lot of competing answers in his head. The one he picked took the form of dry humor.
These shops are collapsing under their own weight as it is, he said with chagrin. We don't have the people or the money to cut you up, even if we cared to.
Thomas breathed a sigh of relief.
What about me, sir?
Thomas had never heard Diesel utter the word sir without sarcasm. It was harrowing.
I'm low on fuel and in need of a tune-up. Would you be so kind as to... No!
The man was cold and unflinching.
Not you. Never you.
Misery bled into every corner of Diesel's face.
Sir. Look around, engine. Look at the state of things.
He gestured to the dismal surroundings, his temper rising.
This place is dying. and you are partly to blame.
Thomas gasped. Diesel whimpered.
I only ever wanted what was best for British Railways, sir. So you say, but your acts of sabotage have crippled these shops. You call it sabotage, I call it quality control. You know those engines were not up to snuff. That was never your call to make. Making suggestions, that's one thing. But you derailed a whole bloody train. All of those motors. We lost thousands of pounds. You would have lost millions if those wretched designs had made it into mass production. I averted a catastrophe. You're obsessed. You and your lust for perfection. I would rather have had diesels that worked. It's all or nothing with you. And I've had it.
Diesel winced. He lowered his voice and said gently,
Sir, I know you share my vision. Not anymore, the engineer scowled. We're weaker for having ever built you. So no, you rotten engine. The last thing I will do is expend more of our precious resources to keep you running. Leave. Now.
And Pilkington stomped under the half-closed garage door and hit the button from the inside. Slowly, painstakingly, Diesel's last remaining view into Derby Diesel Works narrowed to a sliver until the door met the ground with a bang, and he was shut out forever. His whimpering continued. He was a wreck.
It wasn't sabotage,
he hissed bitterly to himself. Thomas ventured to ask, what wasn't? Diesel just glared back at him. One icy look told Thomas he would never get a full explanation.
There's one thing I must see before we leave,
the Diesel said solemnly.
Come with me.
It's not like Thomas had much choice. They moved slowly away from the main workshops and switched to the outer line that curved around the whole facility. On the other side of these tracks stood a rather mundane line of office buildings. But Diesel's eyes lit up when he saw them.
Take a good look, tank engine, Diesel said with reverence. Those are the most advanced railway laboratories in all of Britain.
Really? Puzzled Thomas. They just look like boring old buildings to me. Diesel's face fell. Of course he wouldn't understand.
They weren't designed for style. They were designed for function. That there is the former LMS Research Laboratory, and further down the road you'll find the Railway Technical Center. This single row of buildings is the design epicenter of the network. They are truly the brain of British railways.
Thomas squinted at them. Perhaps that explained why they were so small. Thankfully, Diesel couldn't hear that thought. He carried on proudly.
Within those harrowed halls, countless strides in engineering were made.
And I presume one of those strides was you, said Thomas, unamused.
Why, of course, the Diesel replied. The 08 Shunter is the most refined class of locomotive in railway history.
It sounded terribly vain to Thomas, but Diesel said it in a tone that implied it was a fact. Well, how do you figure that? Challenged Thomas.
Our earliest prototypes were constructed in the 1930s. They were refined for decades until they became fit for mass production. Now, there are well over 900 of us.
This information was dizzying to Thomas. Not the bit about there being almost 1,000 Bronx. That's something Diesel boasted about regularly. What stunned him was the date. Diesels. As early as the 30s. But diesels weren't a thing until the 50s at least. No way you were in development that long.
My claims of superiority are not hollow, Thomas. They are empirical fact. A lot of very intelligent scientists worked for years to perfect my blueprints. I am a model of efficiency.
Thomas couldn't help but notice the wording. Scientists, not engineers. Diesel prioritized logic and reason above everything else. Most engines took pride in their speed or strength. Diesel had no such fixations. He took pride in being the best suited for his designated task. It had nothing to do with the grandeur of what he was, and everything to do with the precision of it. He had been devised in a highly clinical fashion. He was literally a product of a laboratory. Perhaps that was what made him so different. Perhaps that is how he knew so much, more than any engine was ever meant to know. He gazed at the former laboratory buildings once more.
These works have a long history of innovation,
Diesel said with considerable pride.
To think that the likes of George Stephenson worked here for a time. Astonishing.
Thomas was taken aback. George Stephenson? You find that astonishing?
Well, of course. Don't you?
Of course I do. He's the father of the steam engine, which is why I'd expect you to loathe him. Diesel's face fell. He looked genuinely surprised.
I don't detest steam engines.
He said it in the most honest voice Thomas had ever heard him use. Are you joking? Laughed Thomas.
No, and he grew stern. I do not detest steam. I detest that it is still in use today. The rocket was a legend, and the man who designed it was a visionary. I have nothing but respect for George Stephenson.
And for a moment, the two railway engines fell silent, in honor of a man they both admired equally. It was a camaraderie Thomas never imagined he could have with devious Diesel.
Ever since the Industrial Revolution, this country has toiled away in the pursuit of one magnificent goal. A goal that I have given my life to progress.
And his eyes swept over the laboratories again lovingly.
Perfect, uncompromising efficiency. In all areas of life, most of all the railways. That is the point of it all. That is my only dream.
The twinkle in his eyes. Thomas had never seen it on Diesel's face. But it was familiar. It was the same twinkle Gordon had had when he was talking about the Express, that Duck had when he talked about the Great Western, and that he must have had every time he spoke of his own branch line. A pure, passionate, unadulterated love of something he valued. This was Diesel's one great love, perhaps the only thing he had ever loved, the concept of efficiency itself. And now, he was grieving it.
They're rotting,
he said, with great heartache.
They've shut down so many facilities since I was last here, and those that are still open are in a state. How can this happen to Britain's greatest works?
It happened to Brighton, said Thomas plainly and sadly. Stepney told me they were torn down years ago. He's right, isn't he? Diesel's voice wavered, still stricken with grief.
Yes. I've been there. It's all car parks now.
Thomas whinged. Stepney had spared him that detail. Then, it dawned on Diesel what Thomas's words had meant.
Wait a moment. Are you insinuating that Brighton was the finest works in the world?
Thomas only blushed. He didn't typically indulge in these types of arguments. Gordon and Duck would bicker endlessly about whether Doncaster or Swindon was the superior plant. Thomas had never bothered. He'd rather focus on what he had accomplished than where he had come from. But he did have an opinion, and it was a firmly held opinion. There has never been anywhere better, he said plainly, though he knew Diesel would never agree. Diesel only spluttered indignantly and returned to his grief.
It isn't fair,
he bemoaned, as if he were watching a beautiful creature die before him, like an ailing stag or deer.
Derby is the key to all of this railway's crippling inadequacies. They could fix everything if only they would utilize this place properly.
But that was never going to happen. Within 2 years from then, the works would be closed entirely. Another nail in the coffin for devious Diesel's precious dream. Soon, Derby was far behind them, towering rooftops disappearing behind the dense cityscape. Might well be the last time either of them ever saw the place. As they rolled slowly away, Diesel was more sluggish than usual. Thomas couldn't see his face, but he could swear he heard the Diesel sniffling. It sounded as if he was crying.